Welcome, Bruce, to the Happier at Work podcast. I'm absolutely delighted to have you as my guest today. Do you want to give people a little bit of a flavour of who you are, what you're about, and a little bit of an introduction?
Yeah, hi, I'm Bruce Daisley. I used to work at technology companies like Google and Twitter. I worked for a long time at those firms. And during that time, I think I just became obsessed with workplace culture. I became obsessed with when the dynamics of teams help them feel better than other teams. And, that was largely informed by the fact that, sorry, my phone was going. That was largely informed by the fact that some teams I worked with, could sit side by side with other teams, and yet their working dynamics seemed fundamentally different. And so I left Twitter, and I decided I'd started doing a podcast about workplace culture at a time when I felt like I needed some direction myself while I was still in the job. And the podcast and the books that come from it have become the focus of my work, really. I do a newsletter which goes to about 15,000 people across the UK and Ireland. And it's just a sort of a constant focus thinking about what the future of work looks like, really.
Yeah, and I'm a huge fan of the podcast. For anyone who doesn't listen, I highly recommend going checking it out. And if you're a fan of this podcast, you'd definitely be a fan of Bruce's podcast as well. You had a book come out recently called Fortitude, which I've started reading. I haven't finished it yet, but we met in person at an event back in June, I think it was, in Dublin. Had a great chat about all things podcasting. You were telling me all about this upcoming book, Fortitude, and how it's a slightly different approach to resilience, because we often talk about resilience at work and how people need to just be more resilient. And I love the approach of the book, that it kind of takes a slightly different slant around that. Do you want to give people a kind of some of the insights maybe that you learned that you weren't aware of prior to the book, or some of the key points from it?
Yeah, well, the first instance is the fact that there's so much resilience talk around. It's hard to work in a modern day workplace and not hear talk about the team need to be more resilient, or should we get a resilience course, or should we try and find a way for people to be more resilient? And actually, it's something that permeates schools as well. Schools are full of resilience talk. We need to teach kids how to be more resilient. We need to teach them growth mindset. We need to teach them how to be more gritty. And I guess I was interested in that phenomena. I was interested in that idea that we're seeing all this talk around. And simultaneously, I guess the reason why we're seeing so much of that talk is that in parallel, there's a feeling that people are less resilient. And so why on earth would that be the case? And so that's it. The book is an investigation into those things, really, trying to understand what on earth is resilience, why we're hearing so much talk of it, and what's the real origin of it. And, in places, it's a detective story. It's trying to understand that resilience course that you got sent on at work, who wrote it, and how dare they, how dare someone tell you that they can create resilience? And, what was the foundation for it? And, there's a really interesting answer to that. Broadly, majority of the work in those training courses comes from what I style the resilience orthodoxy, which is the work of 2 or 3 psychologists, American psychologists, and that's a clue, because they come from a very individualistic school of psychology.
Okay, yeah,
And so that was a fascination. And the next thing really was just trying to understand, well, I think it's pretty clear to us that resilience does exist, and we see it in people in Ukraine. We see it in people surviving the Pakistani floods right now. We see it around us all of the time. It seems to produce this inner strength in a really low time. So I wanted to reconcile those things, that we often see an absence of resilience when we look for it in an individualized world, and yet when we see people who are finding themselves in the throes of collectivism, they seem to exhibit an abundance of it. And the book is really an exploration of that, where broadly the spoiler is that resilience is the strength we draw from each other. And I think the moment you recognize that, and the moment you say, okay, absolutely, all of those episodes where people have exhibited resilience, they are emboldened by the community, the group that they feel part of. As soon as you recognize it, you go, oh wow, why on earth do we not get taught that simple lesson before. And so the book's, an obsession, an exploration. It's part sort of detective story to try to track down those things, really.
Yeah, I think it's really important, that insight, that first of all, the fact that we're asking, are people less resilient? I think there is a lot of talk about resilience, and interestingly, exactly like you said, Bruce, oh, let's send people on a resilience course, rather than the perception that we've created an environment in which people feel like they're struggling, like they're overstressed, like they're burning out. The kind of the onus is put on the individual then to be more resilient, as opposed to the organization to cause less stress, or cause, reduce the workload, or change the focus, or something like that. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I had someone come to fix my Wi-Fi, actually, and he said to me, he said in passing, actually, he said, never in the history of calming down has someone calmed down by
Oh
being
yeah, yeah,
told to calm down. And
absolutely, yeah.
resilience is a little bit like that. Resilience, never in the history of resilience, someone being more resilient by being told, by being sent on a webinar of how to be more resilient, And the problem is that because we peddle this individualized of resilience, when people get sent on a course, and let's look into what those courses often contain. The leading psychologist, his resilience course encourages you to hunt the good stuff in your life.
Mm.
It's it's a strange perspective. You might have significant family problems, you might have money worries, you might be entering the cost of living crisis, and someone says to you, the problem with you're not looking for the good stuff. Yeah, I'm not sure that's the empathy I was looking for right now.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
and so, it's a really interesting perspective, sort of looking into these things, because I think to a large extent there's a degree of misdirection. Like I say, the leading psychologist, the psychologist who forms the foundational work for most of this resilience training, is a really esteemed psychologist called Martin Seligman. But if you hear him talk, he's avowedly an old school, a sort of traditional Republican. And he, strongly believes that individuals need to take responsibility for the outcomes of their lives.
Mm.
And, I get it. Maybe to some extent, we do need to have some degree of ownership of what's going on in our lives. But I think, to say that resolutely is a blank sheet of paper, that we all start from the same position, is a degree unempathetic. So,
Mm.
yeah, I mean, look, it's been the book's been a labor of love the last 2 years, and and in fact, on my own podcast this week, I've included me talking to a sort of a brilliant academic, a brilliant advertising man, Rory Sutherland, who he's well regarded, and talking about the themes of the book. So I think firstly, it's been fascinating discussion that's come from it, and exactly, I've been thrilled with how the book's done. It's been a top 5 bestseller over in the UK. I know
Amazing.
it's sold really well in Ireland as well. I've been over for a couple of events in Ireland, so yeah, delighted with the success of it.
Brilliant. No, it's really great. And I love this whole approach that it's about community, and there is a lot of talk of personal responsibility, and I am a big believer in taking personal responsibility. But when we're talking about things like resilience, maybe then that comes into the kind of general conclusion of the book being, it's about collectivism as opposed to individualism, and it's not about just focusing on yourself. It's about, and does that mean then that we're, in order to be more resilient, that we're helping other people, that we're kind of forming part of a group, and we're, in order to be helped ourselves, we're offering help to other people?
Yeah, it's more necessarily not necessarily helping other people, but it's recognizing that the a sense of collective strength is
Mm.
what protects us. So there's an American sociologist, really, a guy called Robert Putnam, who wrote a book that became a really huge success around the millennium in the US, called Bowling Alone. And he just talked about the phenomenon of how US society was becoming more individualized and less
Mm.
collectivist.
Yeah.
People were still bowling as much as they bowled before, but they weren't part of bowling leagues, they weren't part of bowling clubs. And he was just interested in that phenomenon. And his conclusion was that if you smoke 15 cigarettes a day, but you're not a part of any group, I would advise you to join a group before you consider giving up cigarettes. He said,
Wow.
effectively, the groups protect us. Now, as
Yeah.
soon as you start identifying this, and I found the whole realm of psychology around this is something called social identity. And what you find is that, if the work peddling that old school individualized version of resilience is pretty flaky, the research about social identity is dazzlingly strong. To the extent that you can look at people who maybe have major heart operations or go into hospital with an episode of depression, and the biggest predictor of how well they will be in 3 or 5 years' time is how many groups they report being part of. Wow, that's astonishing. And if you see the graphs of it, it is dazzling. I'll give you another example. The world's leading expert on teenage mental health is a woman called Jean Twenge. And look, she's pretty, I think, critical of the state of teenage mental health. She speaks about the challenges that teenagers face in the modern era. But one of the things she observed in the course of the pandemic, and this was right at the start of the pandemic, so we'll go sort of delete from memory some of our the burns, the scars from the pandemic. Most of us, I think, would say that the pandemic has been a mental health disaster, but she studied the period right at the start of the pandemic, so maybe before anything came to pass afterwards. And she said teenagers who reported having a family meal each evening, they were sitting down with their mums, their dads, their families, whatever their family looks like, they were having a family meal each evening, their resilience went up and their depression went down. Resilience is the strength we draw from other people. And the more that we're reminded to the connections of other people, the more we're able to tap into it. Now, for a podcast like this, actually, that's got a really direct relevance. The biggest predictor of people being engaged with their jobs, the biggest predictor of people being happy at work from the workforce survey, there's someone has a best friend at work. And so, if anyone listening to this is thinking, okay, so, how do I achieve my own happiness at work? How do I elicit happiness in others? Then, as much as it doesn't feel like the sort of thing that would ever trouble an MBA course or find itself on a business degree, actually having a best friend at work is the biggest predictor. It's the biggest thing you can do to motivate your team. And, actually, if you look into that Gallup workforce survey, they published the latest version a couple of months ago. The latest version of the Gallup workforce survey says that the people who work a hybrid job, and increasingly that is all of us who do knowledge work, so it's half of the workforce, and people who have work a hybrid job, only 17% of them in a global study, only 17% of them report having a best friend at work. So what does that mean? Well, look, firstly, if resilience is the strength we draw from each other, if having a best friend at work is the biggest predictor of us feeling happy at work, then, one of the things that we might set ourselves the challenge is, how can we create an environment where people here are best friends, or people here feel like they've got someone they can go and gossip with, go and cry on the shoulder of, go and moan about, their workload? How can we make sure that people have got those degrees of connection even when they are working in a hybrid environment? And I think, that's for me the critical lesson of this. We're entering an era which I think holistically, societally, is better, where work might be a smaller part of our identity than it has been till now. But we're also entering into an era where, left unchecked, we could be lonelier and more disconnected than ever before.
There's so many things that I want to dig in as part of what you've just said. In my last corporate role, I was one of the representatives helping to interpret the Gallup survey, and one of the big questions that people had a problem with was this idea of a best friend at work. I think it's a bit more American than probably what we're used to in Europe. I don't know, do we call people our best friends at work? Might be a work wife or a work husband or a or something like that, but you don't necessarily say that it's your best friend. I think people associate best friends as being outside of work. I love this idea that, or not that I love this idea, but I love the insight that work is becoming a smaller part of our identity. And on previous podcasts and in various discussions I've had with people, we've been talking about what work means, and And previously, we had a greater sense of community, maybe from the church in Ireland, where people go to mass on a regular basis, a bit more involved in community events. And work, to a degree, has replaced that. So you go to work, and that's where you find your sense of community, your sense of connection with other people. And that's sort of taken over. And I think, to your point earlier, Bruce, about the pandemic and people working in this hybrid environment, we've maybe lost that sense of connection. We've lost that sense of having a best friend at work, or having someone to kind of talk to. In building on that point, totally agree with this idea of like just having someone to talk to and to moan to and to have a bit of a gossip with. I think it's really great. But interestingly, I want to share a couple of personal examples from me, where I had a couple of people at work who I used to go to lunch with on a regular basis and complain. And all I did was complain about what was happening at work. And through one thing and another, one person was on a contract and she left, and the other person got a new job and she left. And I wasn't going for lunch and talking and moaning about work on a regular basis. And I started to enjoy my work a lot more because I wasn't moaning about it so much. Interesting. So that's point number one. Point number two, there was a time where I did feel like I had a best friend at work, and then I was promoted into a position, and in that organization it was very much an us and them. And so when I was promoted, I felt very isolated from I felt I'm part of this leadership team now, and I don't feel like I'm part of the kind of the group that I had been previously. So any insights or any thoughts on those kind of personal examples?
Yeah, I mean, look, uh, look, the challenge of sort of finding yourself having a confidant and moaning. Look, they were felt feelings. I'm not sure whether repressing them makes you happier, but yeah, there is some interesting evidence about when people work in an environment with a bad apple. These
Okay,
research
yeah.
that was done that took an environment, and they brought along someone to different team dynamics. They brought someone who was going to be negative. There was going to be brought someone who was going to be a moaner. They brought
Yeah.
someone who slouched and lay with their head on the table saying this is boring. And what they discovered was that the overall performance of the team dropped by up to 50% by
Wow.
the presence of someone who was like this mood killer, the vibe killer. And
Yeah.
so, having negativity around most definitely plays a part. I've never heard someone feeling bad about their own negativities. Yeah, but these things most definitely do play a part on our experience. Remind me the second part of the question.
The second one was being promoted then. And so there was a very much a culture of us and them. It
Oh,
wasn't really a collective culture. So being promoted and then feeling quite isolated from someone who had formerly been what I would have considered my best friend at work.
yeah, I mean, no doubt, like the old truism that it's tough at the top and it's also relatively tough in the middle. That not having someone that you can confide in. I think it's the biggest challenge that bosses and leaders have. They'd have no one
Yeah.
that they can go and moan to, that can go and unburden themselves to.
Yeah.
And that sense of isolation is why so many senior leaders find themselves joining networking clubs of like minds, because they just want someone that they can admit that they don't know what they're doing all the time, and they
Yeah.
or admit that they're frustrated with the way that work's playing out. So most definitely I think that's an observable phenomenon,
Yeah.
not just in yourself but across
Yeah.
the whole
Uh,
environment really.
Everyone has that. It's so interesting. I'd love to know a little bit more then. At the start, when you were kind of talking about when you're introducing yourself, you talked about this idea of team dynamics. And I'm really curious as to how we can bring in this concept of resilience and working as part of a community, as part of a collective, rather than an individualistic work approach. What are your thoughts around team dynamics and how to apply what you learned from the book into that kind of team dynamics, and how that plays out in the workplace?
Yeah, look, I became fixated with it, and I think over the course of the last few years, there's definitely been more attention that's gone into components like psychological safety and understanding that. And what really struck me over the course of the last couple of years, really, was that I spend a lot of time, anytime there's a new workplace culture book that comes out, sort of spend my time sort of reading it and trying to interpret it. And there was one thing that struck me in the course of the last 12 months where I've observed a discrepancy between the US philosophy and workplace culture and probably a more global perspective outside the US. So if you read a lot of the books and you see a lot of the conversation about team culture, and this is important because Silicon Valley has had such a global impact in the last 20 or 30 years. But books about culture in America broadly are consistent with things that, people like Reed Hastings, the founder of Netflix, says. He says culture is what you choose to reward and what you choose to punish. Or Ben Horowitz, who wrote a really fabulous book called "What You Do Is Who You Are," and he talked about culture is, the incentives and the penalties inside an organization. It's the pattern of behaviors that you hope that most people will observe most of the time. Now, absolutely all of these things, and I've found myself as a consequence of that watching the interpretation of these things. Over the course of the last couple of years, I've consulted with sort of a whole load of different companies, and what you find is that US firms generally interpret that as the culture is the roadmap, it's the highway code, it's the rules of engagement. But there's something fundamental missing about that. Culture is the bit about having a best friend at work. Culture is the sense of connection and affiliation. Culture is the sense of team cohesion. For me, culture is the sense that we're all in it together. And it's quite often missed from those interpretations. So, for me, there's something that is far more emotional, that's a visceral connection between people that, okay, I feel like we're all on the same side. And look, I'm not saying American commentators can't observe this, because one of the best academics passed away this year, but she was a truly brilliant academic who studied this, was a woman called Sigal Barside. And she talked about companionate love. She talked about when she studied firefighters or cricket players or people working in an office environment, the thing that often characterized the best performance was that they had a fondness of each other that was, she said, a sort of platonic, but a companionate love, a sort of an affection for each other that meant that they all pulled in the same direction. Now, look, this is really instrumental for me. I think one of the biggest challenges of organizational culture and thinking about team dynamics is this obsession with the red herring of purpose. For me, the notion that you might be working somewhere and that you've got this purpose that we want to create. You work in a sandwich bar. We want to create the best sandwiches if you've worked in bars, restaurants, quite often they're not trying to create the best. There's no aspiration. They're firmly in the middle. Their price point they're operating is that it's a convenience. We're not trying to do the best of anything. However, if you think about it from an identity perspective, then you say, a lot of the people here are thinking, okay, we've got a great dynamic here. If you've worked in bars and restaurants, you witness this really visibly, but I've worked in retail as well. You see people and they're like, okay, we're not claiming we're the best. We're not like the big I am, but we've got a really good team dynamic here. If someone's off sick, we all pull for each other. If someone comes and says, oh, my cat's just been run over, then we'll all be like, you go home, we'll cover for you. That's an identity. That's not about purpose. That's about identity. And unfortunately, we've misappropriated it. And as soon as you recognize that it's an identity thing, it's about like the pride of the work we do. We're a part of something and we feel an affinity with each other. I think it makes a lot more sense for me.
Yeah, there's a few things I'd love to pick up on. Really interesting insights, and I knew that the culture in the US is different to the culture, say, in a lot of other places that I've worked. But it's an interesting insight that the US is kind of more about the rules, and here's the rules that you need to follow, and it's your personal responsibility. Maybe going back to our earlier point, it's your personal responsibility to follow these rules in order to create this great culture. And then from a rest of the world / Europe, it's more about that connection and affiliation. But to your point about Silicon Valley and how Silicon Valley and the companies coming out of the US have really grown globally, does that then have an impact on the cultures in other parts? Is there maybe a slight jarring if someone joins, say, a US company and they previously had worked for a different company? Is there a different style, or is there or is that kind of reinterpreted within? So first of all, I'd love to get your thoughts on that. I have some other kind of questions I'd love to follow up on as well.
Yeah, most definitely. I think these things have a really big bearing because, if you don't have a consideration for we're all in it together, then what ends up happening is what's happened to a lot of us. What's happened about work to a lot of people over the course of the last year or so is that our connection with work has changed, and work is no longer something that lives in our life and has a relationship with us like school, like really tightly knit. If you missed a day at school, it felt like you would never catch up with the gossip. You felt like you'd never your connection to the group was loosened because you hadn't been there yesterday. You almost felt apologetic because you were sort of trying to find your way back into the shared experience. And that was the experience at school. Well, it was a little bit like that. The people next to you gossip with you. Might be on a tea round with people where you'd make teas, or someone would bring some form of carbohydrate based snack back, and you'd the delight of sharing a packet of biscuits was immense. Those things are really cohesive, and we've moved from that relationship to something closer to our experience of university, where the people on your course you often had a loose connection with, you might occasionally have socialized with. Most people spend their weekends a broader collection of people from maybe where you lived, or someone's sports mate, or a broader collection
or
of people,
clubs and societies and things that people joined as well.
That's right. So at college, your course was less a part of your identity. You often didn't know what courses your friends were on at college, at university. Your course was less of an identity. That's why we've moved to with work. What the consequences are that organizations saw an increase in their resignation rate as soon as about 12 months ago, and it's not gone back down. And everyone thought that was sort of something going through the system. No. It was because we've become a little more semi-detached from our jobs, and we've started perceiving that work is an important part of what we do, but it's not the defining part that sits at the center of what we do. Now, look, that might change, but I think it poses really critical questions for anyone in this space, because it sort of begs the question of us, how can you create good, cohesive environments where you're not together every day? And I think the answer to that is you need to try to do things differently. To try to presume that team cohesion will come from, a casual bit of chitter-chatter during the course of the week. It's not going to come in that same way. You need to think about creating it in a far more explicit way, I think.
So it's really interesting what you're saying about work is not really a defining part of what we do anymore. And I can see that to an extent. But equally, what my interpretation, I suppose, of the Great Resignation, whatever you want to call it, we haven't really seen that much of it here in Ireland yet. But my interpretation was people are looking for a greater sense of meaning in what they do, a greater sense of impact, and maybe a greater sense of belonging in whatever organization they choose to work in. And during the pandemic, they came to this realization that what they were doing was not really what they wanted to do. It's not really how they wanted to be spending their time. And so they're looking for something more from work, because it has because we spend, from my perspective, we spend so much time at work. So you want to make it something that you really enjoy. I understand that it's becoming less relevant, but if it is that kind of, so how much time we're spending at work, and to make it have that greater sense of meaning, and have, to go back to that idea of the purpose, that how can you create more of that? That was my interpretation of the Great Resignation. But I can also see the perspective that work is playing less of a role, and it's more about community in wherever we live, family, and the friends that we already have outside of that work context.
Yeah, well, look, I was at an event in Dublin about 3 weeks ago where people were talking about a selection of businesses, and they were talking about all of them carrying a resignation rate that was in the 20s, 20%
Oh, wow.
plus.
Okay.
So, I'm pretty convinced that it is a pretty widespread phenomenon. The only reason I would push, yeah, The only reason I would push back on the idea that this is a pursuit of meaning
Mm,
is because broadly what you hear from recruiters is they say, and I was sat down with someone last week who was telling me the challenge they've got right now is people are just leaving for more money. Now,
okay.
if it was a pursuit of meaning, then what I suspect you'd find is that there would be an influx into the jobs that we typically regard as being imbued with a great deal of purpose,
Mm,
teaching, nursing, sort of jobs of substance. And I don't think, based on what we've seen from those sectors, that we're seeing that. I don't think the teaching profession is inundated with those things. So look, I'm intrigued with your perspective. I've scribbled down on this post-it note in front of me that I'm going to go away and see if there's anything to back that up.
yeah.
But
Well, maybe
right
it's more.
now, I'm not convinced.
Maybe it's less about and I've heard this on Adam Grant's podcast, this idea that you don't have to be going out to save the whales. You don't have to have that big, massive impact on the world, but something that holds a little bit more meaning for you. Maybe the company that you work in has maybe poor ethics, or that you've seen stuff happening or something like that. But in addition to this idea of belonging and feeling like, from my own perspective and from the research I did, the sense of values have become really, really important. And it's not something that we've necessarily covered on this podcast, but I think this idea of values aligning with the overall values of the organization, which means the collective values of everyone else who works there as well. I think that for me is really important. And if you find that during the pandemic that didn't, that there was some sort of a clash there, or that you realized that this wasn't the right thing for you, that you made a decision. I'm also hugely interested in this idea of people leaving for more money. I've also heard stories of people leaving. Now, from my perspective, that is because of the challenge. There's talent shortages out there, and people are offering more money for people to leave. And I don't think that that's sustainable in the long term. My own understanding of that is that people are offering more money. People have decided, okay, I'm going to take more money in order to leave, but without much thought around, well, what's the culture going to be like when I join this new organization? Or, what are they doing that's different to what I'm doing? That kind of thing. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think this is a critical thing. If you look on Glassdoor, international data on Glassdoor suggests that typically the number one thing that people said that was the most important thing about a job was the workplace culture. It was higher than the terms and conditions. It was higher than the salary. Now, I wonder if the fact that people are finding that they're working from the same desk 3 days a week and that's their home, and 2 days a week they're venturing into the office, they think, well, as bad as the culture might be there, I can handle it. And they're saying to themselves that culture might be less important. We've not seen it yet on the Glassdoor work, but it's an interesting thing. Most definitely. Look, a lot of us, because of the failings of the way that society's set up, a lot of us use work as a proxy for a social life in our 20s. And, we use it as a way to feel connected, amused, entertained, occupied. So how those things will change, I don't know. At the very least, I did some really enlightening work. As part of the research for the book, I went along to a public hospital, NHS hospital in the UK, and I watched some of the hospital team because they were learning how to deal with difficult patients. And the reason why this has become more imposing, the isolation of the pandemic, strangely, as people were seeing fewer strangers in their life, as they were encountering few people that they didn't know, that insularity strangely was being manifested as aggression. So people were turning up in hospitals and being aggressive with the staff. And so I witnessed them learning how to deal with staff. And I was like, is this a phenomenon? And they were like, it's off the charts. We used to go
Wow.
months without anyone committing violence on a member of staff. Now it's happening weekly. And it's like, wow, okay. They're like, we have no, there's not, the police won't come out to half the things now because they're so underfunded. And so, but they were finding they needed to find a way for staff to deal with this. In fact, their approach was they'd got cabin crew from airlines to come in. So the cabin crew were on COVID related furlough,
Oh,
and
of
they were
course,
like,
yeah,
well,
yeah.
how do you deal with a a passenger who's kicking off and you can't land somewhere and you don't want to, the cost of diverting the plane will lead to all manner of paperwork. How do you deal with a passenger that's kicking off like that? And it was just so intriguing to watch this sort of cross-pollination of them
Yeah.
both dealing with these things. And they said, patients in the hospital were way more violent than ever before. It's a reflection of isolation. So look, while I think societally it's a good thing that we might be finding less of our identity from our jobs, that we might be sort of leaning into our passions, our hobbies, the things that we scratched our head to think of what to put at the bottom of our CV might actually become a genuine interest. But I think we need to ensure that if work does play a smaller part in our lives, that we do replace it with something else.
Yeah, and that what those other things are, what lights you up, what brings you joy on a day-to-day basis. Yeah, love that approach. There was one thing that I wanted to ask from something that you mentioned earlier, and this is the idea of having a fondness for each other and the idea that we're all in this together. But I'd love to get your thoughts because I've worked in organizations where that has been absolutely the case, and I've worked in organizations where it's not. If someone goes off sick, you kind of roll your eyes and say, well, that we're, now we've extra workload for us today, and that's really frustrating. Or if someone goes off sick longer term, the frustration that you feel rather than the empathy that you feel towards someone else and say, oh my God, I hope that person is okay. So I've worked in both of those types of environments. And I'd love to get your thoughts on where does that come from? Does that come from leadership? Do they need to set that as an example? Do they need to kind of do it as a rule, as like what are your thoughts in creating that type of environment? Because I'm trying to think of what I'm trying to say here. Like as an individual, I felt like I was in that environment and I learned from the behavior of other people in that environment as opposed to me setting that environment myself.
I was chatting to someone recently and they were saying that they had an issue that right now, any time that they were giving direct feedback to their team, sort of about what the team was doing wrong, the team was going to HR and complaining about them. So that was the scenario they said. And, I've thought about it a lot. I've scratched my head about it a lot. And I think in that instance, there's no substitute for getting people probably in a room and having a long session talking about team dynamics, talking about the realities of how feedback works, experimenting, giving feedback to everyone in the room, thinking about giving feedback, maybe sort of, kicking off by giving collective feedback to a piece of work of someone who wasn't in the room, and practicing creating the communication lines that exist. And, I suspect the thing that we wanted to create a sort of strong, supportive team dynamic, a sense of team cohesion. I need to think about it. There's a book by a woman called Priya Parker, I think, called The Art of Gathering. And she talks about how, effectively, I guess we can all arrange a meeting and we can go to our calendar app and create a meeting and invite people, and that's a meeting. Or we can create something that feels it's got an objective to it, it's got an outcome to it. It's like it's going to be a gathering of people with an intention. And it's a bit like, the difference between creating a PowerPoint slide and creating a TED Talk. A TED Talk tries to take people on an emotional journey. It has a story arc to it. It's got an impact to it. Anyone can create a PowerPoint slide by opening it and pressing new slide. And, anyone can create a meeting by pressing new meeting. But if you want to create something that is going to leave people feeling a sense of connection, then you need to think about it more carefully. And it's another example of how good middle managers are going to really earn their money. Specifically, I'll give you one example. I was did a podcast a couple of weeks ago with an organization called The Moth. And you might have heard of The Moth. They sort of run these storytelling nights. Run them in Dublin, they run them all around the world. True stories told live is the philosophy. And, people stand up and they tell us a story told in the first person about their lives, about something about their experience. And these stories variously can be hilarious. They can be traumatic. They can be astonishing, and they've got a few rules about what a good story. It's got to have stakes. It needs to have change. Really interesting. It's a brilliant book. I did a fabulous podcast on it. Anyway, they told me they run sessions for teams. I was like, okay, Right. But if these, I was just intrigued because, like, if you say a good story needs to be in the first person, it needs to have stakes. How is that relevant for companies? And is this about just making people better at delivering PowerPoint presentations? Is it better? And they're like, oh, no, no, no. The benefit to companies is that when people tell their stories to each other and learn how to tell a story to each other, and they learn how to craft a story so it's got a sort of a story arc to it. When they do that to each other, what we generally find is it transforms the relationship of people. It's like, oh,
Right.
wow. Why? And because the moment that no longer is this just Aoife who sits next to me or used to sit next to me and now it's just a face on a Zoom screen. This is Aoife. I know the journey she's on. I know what she did, and it's moved me, and it's transformational. And I think in the old days, so many of these things were an accident. We used to sit people next to each other. They would pretty much work out who the 2 or 3 people in the office they liked were. They might go and have, sandwich in the park with them, or they might, go for a walk with them at lunchtime. But it was largely accidental. And right now we're in a zone where I think the things that were accidental, we probably need to be better at crafting. And I think, this is why the thing that's going to be so fascinating is that in a year, 2 years, 3 years, there's going to be some organizations that have learned how to do this well. Probably from test and learn, from sort of experimentation. They're going to be sort of saying, wow, we've learned so much, we've developed and improved. And this is going to be some organizations saying, yeah, people these days, they don't want to stay in a job. We're seeing such turnover. There's a problem in the job market. And look, you can almost hear those 2 different perspectives starting to take place already. It's a bit like the old sort of comedian line, which is, you're so much better than last week's audience. The truth is there's no bad audiences, there's no bad employees, there's just bad environments that we create.
Yeah. This is it. And so, Bruce, the question I ask everyone who comes on the podcast: what does being happier at work mean to you?
The best barometer for me of whether I was personally enjoying my job, whether the culture was in a good place, whether I could hear laughter. And, it became an obsession for me. And it's like, okay, well, not in a sort of simplistic way. I think as a barometer, knowing that people are laughing, it means they trust each other. It means they like each other. It means they feel they're safe. Generally, so we laugh. We only laugh with people we like. And, it was a really important barometer. If people were laughing, it wasn't a sign of indolence. It was a sign of connection and affinity. And, I think most of us would say we've probably laughed less in the post-COVID era than we did before. And, that absence of having a best friend at work is an illustration that most of us wouldn't necessarily say that we laughed as much. So I think this is it, knowing that finding a route to having more laughter at work is actually a noble thing and a good thing and a way for us to enjoy the time, the 40 plus, 50 plus years that we're going to spend working.
Yeah, I love that idea. And I very deliberately sought out during the pandemic when I was living alone, when I was feeling a bit isolated, when we couldn't leave the house or couldn't go too far from the house. I very deliberately watched things to make me laugh in the evening. So things like Modern Family. I had, what else did I have? Curb Your Enthusiasm, things that made me laugh out loud. And I absolutely needed that every day. But it's probably something I've not done enough of in the interim. So love that. So for anyone who would like to connect with you, what is the best way to do that? And also how they get hold of your book?
Yeah, so you can look, the best way to find out more about the book is if you go to my website, eatsleepworkrepeat.com, and you can sign up to my newsletter or hear the podcast there. And the books, you'll see some of the comments that people have written, or maybe you have the opportunity to see some of the discussion and debate about it. So and I really welcome people getting in touch. I've done quite a few events in Dublin. I'm often there, and I've love people getting in touch via LinkedIn or via the website.
Brilliant. And that's how we connected originally, I think, was on LinkedIn. And then by chance you were speaking at an event that I attended in Dublin, so I had the opportunity to meet in person, which was brilliant. So thank you so much for your time today and sharing your insights. I always love to hear what you have to say and get your insights and your thoughts on all things work culture, and this idea of the team dynamics, and what the pandemic has done to kind of to change things and what we can do about it. Absolutely thoroughly enjoyed the conversation today. Thank you so much, Bruce.
Thank you. I'm really grateful for the chat.